Okay, it's 12:05. I'm going to start our program today. So super glad to have you all here today. I woke up this morning excited about this conversation because of the amazing panel that we have dropping knowledge to us today and helping us understand deeper nuances of housing and housing justice. So thank you for joining us. A new vision for housing justice, housing, well-being, and racial equity. This is part one of a two-part series that we are sharing with you today. We highlight this because we know that we are in a humanitarian crisis in this country around housing. And we've heard from so many signers for the Wellbeing Blueprint, so many colleagues, that housing itself is something that needs to be addressed, not yesterday, but today. And so we're super excited about that, and not tomorrow, but today. So hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Natalie Williams, the director of the Wellbeing Blueprint at Full Frame Initiative. Full Frame Initiative, known to many of us as FFI, serves as the backbone organization for the Wellbeing Blueprint. Full Frame Initiative is a national social change organization working to make this country a place where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. The blueprint itself is both a growing community of action of public sector, community, and business and nonprofit leaders, and a roadmap to drive social change that will move us towards equity, well-being, and justice, and bring us closer to that North Star, a country where everyone has a fair shot of well-being. Why is this important, you may be asking yourself? Because, in fact, we all don't have a fair shot. Because racism, sexism, homophobia, and additional otherings are baked into our system and our country, creating fast tracks to well-being for some and dramatically reducing access for others. The Wellbeing Blueprint work and community focuses on fixing systems, not people. We highlight what matters to people and not what's the matter with people. We are all hardwired for well-being. It's a drive and it's not a destination. Well-being is not something we do or have. It's how each of us live our lives. We are individually and collectively healthier, more resilient, more productive when we feel that we belong, that we can count on others, and that they can count on us, that we have what matters to us and have purpose, that we're safe, that things are somewhat predictable, and that our material needs can be met without shame or danger. That is our biological drive for well-being. Housing that is available, it's safe, it's stable, is one of the many well-being drivers, and it meets our needs for access to resources, safety, and stability. Today, in an interactive and innovative discussion, we will unpack this idea of housing justice as it relates to racial justice and racial equity. This conversation will highlight the importance of a few principles in the Wellbeing Blueprint, such as Wellbeing Principle 2, push against harms being concentrated in communities already facing the greatest adversity, by not holding people's criminal background against them as they seek housing, or simply making access to housing meaningful without shaming or creating undue hardship. The Wellbeing Blueprint is a great place to start if you're curious about principles and recommendations to build a country where everyone has a fair shot. We will provide you with more information on the Wellbeing Blueprint and opportunities to access and download it in the close of our session. And we're so excited to have you here today. Before we dive into our session today, I would like to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. To formally recognize the historical and continuing connection between Indigenous people and their native lands. I acknowledge that North Houston, where I live, is the traditional territory of the Sano-Okios people. I acknowledge this legacy as well as the ongoing struggle faced by the Indigenous communities around Houston, Texas, and the country for recognition and land ownership. We all have a responsibility to consider the legacy of colonialism in our history as a nation. I recognize the privileges we enjoy today because of colonialism and strive to understand and break down the systems that perpetuate these harmful patterns while building and supporting systems that are just. I hope you also take the time today to acknowledge the native lands you stand on from wherever you're joining us today. Now, I'm thrilled to be joined by three amazing leaders who are working tirelessly. And listen, y'all, before we got on the call, they already started talking about making connections and the way that they're supporting housing for individuals in different communities and the way that they're all interconnected. So it's going to be a great discussion today. They are working tirelessly to make housing a human right for all people. These leaders are experts in understanding racial justice and racial equity and its impact on people's housing. So first, let me introduce Ms. Kashana Hill, the Executive Director of the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Kashana leads a team working to end discriminatory housing policies and practices through litigation and policy advocacy, along with providing fair housing training and foreclosure prevention counseling. She has been interviewed by CNN, NPR, and countless other national and local media outlets. Additionally, Kashana has written extensively about housing segregation and civil rights and has testified before the United States Congress as a fair housing expert. In 2017, she was the inaugural recipient of the Tulane Law School Public Interest Law Foundation Practitioner Service Award. Kashana is a graduate of Spelman College and Tulane Law School. Thank you so much, Kashana, for being here. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you.
Next, Miss Medina Kearney, who's the Associate Director of Cultural Specific Reentry Programs in Central City Concern. Medina is the Associate Director who oversees programs that incorporate groups, customs, history, and social practices to support BIPOC clients who have recently been released from prison. Medina brings over 18 years of supportive housing experience to support Central City's Concerns, mission to help people find home, regain health, and move towards long-term stability and success. Medina, we are so grateful that you're here spending time with us today. And last but absolutely not least is Ms. Tristia Bauman, Senior Attorney of the National Homelessness Law Center. Tristia combines litigation, legal education, and legislative advocacy strategies to prevent and end homelessness. Her work focuses on combating the criminalization of homelessness and advocating for laws that protect the civil and human rights of homeless people. Tristia also conducts legal trainings around the country, writes reports, and other publications related to housing, and serves as a legal resource for homeless advocates. Tristia began her career at the legal services of Greater Miami, Inc. as a housing attorney working with low-income tenants in federally subsidized housing. She later served for several years as the assistant public defender in Miami-Dade County. Thank you, Tristia. I know your time is super limited, and we are just also very grateful to have you here today. So let's jump in to get to these questions with our panel. I'm going to start with Ms. Medina. If you can share why, and this question will go for our entire panel, but I just want to be a little bit structured in starting with someone. Please share why you are personally involved in your work around housing justice and system change. So we're looking for ideas around where does your commitment and passion for this work come from?
Thanks, Natalie. So for 18 years working in supportive housing, most individuals I was working with were exiting homeless situations, and they also had some justice involvement. Most everyone that had suffered from addiction and houselessness had some type of background. But I did notice that the charges were significantly different, varied because of race. And This was a pattern I've seen over the years. Uh, BIPOC tend to have more serious charges and convictions, and and also in my community, a lot of people, first offenders, having serious convictions that follow them for long periods of time, if not indefinitely. And I started noticing the disparities once working in the culturally specific program here at Flip the Script, even more so. And it's very disheartening. It's unfair in most cases. And it's really hard for people to become successful once they have a criminal background. So that history is a ball and chain for some. And so, and these young men and young women who are highly motivated to change. So it's, most just need some help to navigate how to get their needs met. And that's just why, um, that the script came about so that they could have a full team of folks to help them from employment to housing to medical care to behavioral health and everything that it takes to get someone up and running. So yeah, it's a strong passion of mine to help people make those positive changes and be successful and not return because they weren't fully equipped with the information and supports.
Thank you,
Mhm.
Medina. I'm going to pass that question to Kashana.
Yeah, thank you. The way in which I engage with this work, I think, is based on two things. One is my personal experience. It has been clear to me for a very long time that the privilege that I now have access to is based on the access that I've had to largely white exclusionary spaces, right? So the privilege that I experience with regard to, for instance, my income, my education level, based on the fact, right, that I had access to educational tools and spaces that were not generally meant for people that looked like me. And I also know that I am absolutely no smarter or no better than, other Black and brown children all across the country. And so
Wait a second.
I think maybe we had someone come off mute and then I got muted somehow. So please excuse that interruption. But it's clear to me that kids who look just like me certainly should have access to the same kinds of outcomes and opportunities that I've had access to, and that what we are able to accomplish and experience in this life should not be tied to the accident of the kinds of spaces that we have access to. And so my personal experience is really aligned with the lived reality for people all across this country. And so I do the work that I do because it is very clear that all of the continuing inequities across the United States, no matter the issue that we care about, all of those continuing inequities really have their roots in this country's history of mass displacement, land theft, right, and discriminatory and racist housing policy. And those policies have never been fully discussed and certainly have not been fully addressed. And there has never been a large-scale remedy for the discriminatory and racist housing policy that created our current structures. And so knowing that where we live really does shape the access that we have to opportunity is the place where I enter into the work. And it is the reason why I have chosen to dedicate my career to housing justice.
Thank you, Kashana. Tristia?
A lot of the themes that Kashana highlighted are really similar. to ones that reflect my experience. So I grew up in a very small, all-white town as a mixed race kid. My dad is disabled and had done everything right as we think about it in the US. He obtained an education, he worked really hard, he had ascended to be an executive director of a nonprofit, and he hurt himself. And it's the type of injury that could happen to absolutely anyone. He had to stop working. And that happened when I was very young. And when my sister, shout out Tamara Bauman, who's also here on today's call, we both work in homelessness and on social advocacy. And I think our young experience really shaped that. We saw that no matter what choices people make, we can be vulnerable to housing loss and housing insecurity. And that's what we experienced. Our mom is an immigrant from the island of Tonga. Tonga is one of the Pacific Islands, and Pacific Islanders have the highest rate of homelessness in the United States. And that type of disparity between the experiences of people in Tonga, a developing nation where homelessness is not very prevalent because there is a social structure in place for caring for others, and America, an extremely wealthy country where homelessness is a growing reality for more and more people, and not one that is equally applied. It absolutely is disproportionately affecting people who are already vulnerable and marginalized through systems that can be set up through law and dismantled through law. So, those young experiences, I think, helped me to see that housing insecurity and vulnerability to homelessness are real, that there are no differences, just as Kashana was saying, there are no differences between myself and other people, or people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness now and those who are housed and wealthy. All people are valuable. There's talents in people all across the income spectrum from every community, and everyone deserves dignity and a chance to succeed and thrive. And so I went to law school with the sole purpose of trying to use legal skills to support movements. And I think it's only when we organize and work together on a movement that we can actually achieve social change, and we need it in this country.
Thank you so much. My next question really digs into your day-to-day. Can you share with us a brief overview of your agency or your advocacy, something like what's the mission, major elements of the work? And I will start with Kashana.
Thank you. So the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center's mission is to eradicate housing discrimination and segregation across the state of Louisiana. And so we do that work in a variety of different ways. One thing which you mentioned, Natalie, in the introduction is through litigation. So we have very talented attorneys on staff that I'm very lucky to work with, and they provide free legal representation to people who have experienced housing discrimination. We may also litigate cases as an organization, right? Because again, the goal is to challenge discriminatory systems. And so when we think about fair housing, we do our work in a very holistic way. Not only are we looking at what discriminatory experiences individuals may have had, for instance, when communicating with the landlord, we are looking at the systems. What access to housing do people have? Where is that housing located that they have access to, right? Is it accessible to people with disabilities? How do the zoning laws and how are land use decisions made? Are they made in ways that limit certain kinds of housing to certain kinds of neighborhood? And so we really challenge the system with our litigation work. We provide legal representation to individuals, and then also will sue anyone from governmental entities. For instance, we sued the state of Louisiana and the federal government over a discriminatory grant formula that they used after Hurricane Katrina. Many of you may know this, but after Katrina made landfall and the majority of the city of New Orleans was flooded, the federal government and our state created a program called the Road Home that was designed to give rebuilding grants to families so that they could get their homes back online line and moved back to the city. Unfortunately, the amount of funding that a family was to receive was based on the pre-storm value of their home. And it wasn't based on the cost that it would take to actually rebuild the home. And so that meant that families located in white neighborhoods were receiving more money to rebuild than families in Black neighborhoods received, even if those homes were similar, of the same age, similar square footage. Just by virtue of owning a home in a white neighborhood, a family was going to receive more money than a similarly situated family in an African-American neighborhood. And so we were able to bring hundreds of millions of more dollars in recovery funding to New Orleanians as a result of that litigation. And I see the question in the chat. That program was Road Home, was the name of the program. So our litigation really looks different depending on the needs of community, depending on what is being experienced at the time. We also conduct testing investigations where we train community members to go out into the housing market and help us determine where and how housing discrimination is occurring. Are we having issues with realtors, for instance, steering people only into certain neighborhoods? Are we having issues with landlords, for instance, who refuse to rent to families with children? So that's a big part of our work as well. We also conduct policy advocacy campaigns at the federal, state, and local levels in order to expand housing access. We're currently at the tail end of a 10-year campaign, actually, to bring something called a Healthy Homes Ordinance to the city of New Orleans. So we are working with a coalition of community-based partners and community members to pressure our city council to create a rental registry program, whereby all of the rental housing in the city would be subject to some sort of minimum health and safety standards. We currently have nothing like that on the books. We also may bring bills to the Louisiana State Legislature, which is not an easy endeavor in terms of expanding access to housing, but we continue to do that year after year. We also do provide lots of educational offerings to community members. So we work with young people who may be entering the rental market for the first time to help prepare them in terms of what they need to know and what they should expect. We work with first-time home buyers so that they have an understanding of how discrimination may present itself in the sales or lending process. We provide free Know Your Rights trainings for renters so that they have an understanding of how housing discrimination presents itself, and so that they know that we are available as a resource if they do experience discrimination or encounter any discriminatory policies. And lastly, our housing counseling department provides foreclosure prevention services to homeowners who are having difficulty paying their mortgages. And we are right now in the midst of implementing a new partnership with the Housing Authority of New Orleans, where we will be supporting and providing services to voucher holders who are interested in moving to well-resourced communities. So again, a very holistic approach to housing access, to equitable housing access, and to housing justice.
Wow, that is amazing. And I know for those of us that have been to New Orleans, we know how badly these services are needed there, but they're needed all over the country. So please check out Kashana's website for more information as to what you can bring to your communities. Tristia, you're up next. And I put the question in the chat for you in case you needed to revisit it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Well, so I'm with the National Homelessness Law Center. It's based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for over 30 years. We used to be known as the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. We are the legal organization whose sole mission is to prevent and end homelessness. And we do that using the power of the law through three primary strategies. One is impact litigation, primarily federal litigation, not exclusively federal litigation, but we work on a number of different issues. My work really focuses on combating the criminalization of homelessness, which sits at the intersection of two inequitable systems that produce inequity and poverty. And that's our carceral system, system of criminal justice, as well as the housing systems that have historically been defined by racist practices and segregation. We also do a lot of housing and civil rights advocacy and human rights advocacy, really at every conceivable level of government. So criminalization laws typically are enacted at the local level, at the city, county levels. So we do a lot of advocacy there, and we do it nationwide. We also advocate at the state and federal levels, as well as the international level, because some of our strongest legal instruments, at least in terms of the desired future and the policy infrastructure that we'd like to see, come from international human rights instruments. And so we do a number of things related to that type of advocacy as well. We also, as our third kind of strategy, do a lot of education and outreach. So, for example, we have published a number of reports on the growing criminalization of homelessness, or on the reasons why the point in time count is an undercount, because there isn't a common methodology, and how that really limits our ability to understand who's experiencing homelessness, the size of the population, and what their needs are when we attempt to address current homelessness, and how that limits our ability to fight to prevent homelessness through really sound and sensible policies. So those are the things that are kind of our strategies. A couple of the programs that I'll mention quickly that I think reflect our work well. We have what's called the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. And what we argue for is investment in housing solutions, not in criminal legal system solutions, which are not, in fact, solutions, that are just ways to corral, control, segregate, and marginalize people, and predominantly people of color, and even more acutely Black people in this country. And so that is one of the things that we work to fight. And through the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, we have a group of lawyers working nationally. There may be some even on this call that participate in what we call the Housing Not Handcuffs Justice Network. We have, your typical sort of resource attributes: an online library. We've got listserv. We have monthly working group meetings, so we can bring in experts, really kind of explore some of the current legal issues. But we also support each other's litigation. Really, that's the thrust of the group, so that we are not reinventing the wheel. We're able to share insight into strategies that work, even more importantly, remedies that work, and that type of collaboration, I think, is really impactful, and it's led to some important cases. One is that I'll just shout out really quickly is the Martin v. Boise case. That's a law center case where the Ninth Circuit, the largest federal appellate court in the country, held that it is unconstitutionally cruel to punish a person for resting outside when they are involuntarily in public space and don't have access to an indoor space. You'd think that that's really duh. The Constitution doesn't allow you to arrest somebody or to punish them for sleeping outside when they lack any indoor location to sleep. But that's where we are with the legal infrastructure, and that holding was recently reaffirmed by a case brought by the Oregon Law Center. Shout out Oregon Law Center. I know Kashana is an alumnus of the Oregon Law Center. And Johnson v. Grants Pass, which affirmed that use of a blanket also cannot be criminalized when a person doesn't have access to alternative ways to protect themselves from the elements. So, these are clearly really incremental wins, but they are important nonetheless, and it's a big part of what we do.
That's amazing. Thank you. Medina?
Hi, thank you, Natalie. And thank you, Trishta and Kashana. That was amazing. The work you do is amazing. As mentioned, I am with Central City Concern, and this is a nonprofit organization that has been around for over 40 years. And the mission is to end homelessness. Flip the Script came about when the idea came from a former Central City Concern employee, a lady by the name of Frida Caesar, who had actually started with Central City Concern about 17, 18 years ago. and on call. She went back to school, and she did a thesis on reentry. And it was based on her lived experience, exiting the criminal justice system, women's prison. And she proposed this offer to Central City Concern. And of course, Central City Concern said, yes, let's build it, a culturally specific program to help people re-enter society. And so Central City Concern's our goal is to end homelessness, and Flip the Scripts model is a minor setback for a major comeback. It sounds great and all. It's definitely what we shoot for, but it's a lot of work on the ground level that goes into an individual to get rent ready, job ready, and all of those things, which is why I'm a strong believer in, because I see it every day, culturally specific programs benefiting people and harden what society would call hardened criminals are changing their lives. They're getting married. They're starting their dream jobs. Home ownership and things like that. So we do a lot of work. It's a little workshop in here, and we all are in this open day type of office setting. And our
Saying
program
that the worker's gonna be
is
leaving this Sunday and we'll be back there.
so our program and the design, we were fortunate enough, and what I'm loving about being in the city of Portland is the partners and the community coming together to make sure this program is successful. I mean, we none of us can do this work alone, and we're seeing members of the Congress and chair and mayors and our CEOs and county partners and city officials and people coming to visit and see what we're doing because it's become a buzzword here, but it's because of how we present. I tell people we're masters at, like picking up on energies. We're used to microaggressions, the Black community, and we live it and see it every day, and eventually that wears on a person's psyche. So when a person walks in the door, we all acknowledge that from myself, the housing specialist, the advocacy coordinator, peer support, case manager, and employment specialist. We acknowledge that individual and we make them feel because they are the most important person in that room. And then they look around and we have all of this African artifacts on the walls that was donated to us by this person from the community that had some experience with the justice system, years of incarceration. And but it's not just what they see; it's how they feel. People are acknowledged. We give them eye contact. We are respectful, and we don't have any written rules on how to present when you come in, but they see how they're treated, and it just flows. It's a two-way street. It's a river. So it's a dynamic thing to watch. It's hard to explain, but it's so important that more and more culturally specific programming is available to people. We have yet, our funders are asking, so when are you going, when will you cut off the referrals? Do you have a wait list? Nope. As long as we're open for business, we're going to accept people. When people are in crisis, they can't wait, and so we serve people. They may have a short moment in time at that day, but they will be seen and acknowledged and given some type of direction, and it's ongoing. It doesn't stop. It's like, well, at what point does a person complete the program? They don't. Sorry, we don't graduate them because once a member, always a member. And we like to keep that flow because we also know that life happens. And what we're seeing, there's these markers like 9 months to 18 months. We're seeing people that have gotten jobs, gotten in a relationship, gotten in an apartment, and doing well, but then the stuff starts coming up, stuff that they were too busy to stop and feel or sense. And a lot of it may be come from mental health because of the experience. And we try to help people sustain their housing and connect them to the wraparound supports to help them, stay housed and so they don't fall back into their old ways or old patterns and, you know, the fear of, all those fears and stuff come up when the wheels start shaking on the bike. I like to look at it like training wheels. When the training wheels are off and you're on this road alone, you tend to, look down and notice them, uh, and then you start to wobble. So we like to be the guardrails and the support to help people stay straight up and become successful. I also want to say the agency, Central City Concern, they offer, health care, primary care, housing, and employment supports, detox. It's a slew of services that this agency offers, which is why I continue and stand behind this agency of all the work that they're doing for the community. And there's no, even from the CEO to the vice president and the people person, the chief people person, any one of the over 1,200 or more employees can walk in, and talk to those individuals, and it's because they want to know what's the problem, how can we help, what do you need? So yeah, thank you, Natalie.
Thank you. I hope what you all are seeing is this continuum, this network. You have a national, a state, and a local commitment, examples of local commitments towards ending homelessness. And through this lens of racial justice and racial equity, this idea of culturally specific programming. I know that those are words that kind of flow off of Medina's tongue, and they're like, oh, it's just culturally specific programming. And what does that, we do this. If you really look at what this organization is doing, it's pretty amazing, from the smells that people get when they enter the housing area, to the way that they're greeted in a culturally specific way, to the way that the rooms are decorated and the art that's on the wall. I think that speaks to a nuance of this work and community that looks like equity, that looks like justice. So really appreciate the work that you're doing, and to see how you're supporting it from the national level, and Kashana, how you're supporting it from the state level, working together to move this big issue forward. And so I want to dig a little bit into, what is the biggest barrier? So I know that there's a ton of barriers to housing individuals in our country, and it starts with root causes and how our country was formed and the privileges that some get and some others do not. But if you could pick one barrier just today, what would it be? What is the biggest barrier to ending our country's housing crisis? And I really would love to start with Tristia.
Normally when I answer a question like this, I think of all of the systemic barriers to equitable access to housing. But if I were to pick just one, I think fundamentally it boils down to our perspective about what housing is and who gets it. We live in a country where housing is considered a commodity, which means that a privileged group of people who can afford that commodity, are the ones who are able to get it. It's not seen as a human right. Despite all the research and all of the experience and just the commonsensical nature of how important a home is to health, to wellness, to ability to thrive, we still are operating in a world where housing is not thought of as a human right, and it is becoming harder and harder to access as a result of so many systemic inequities, like, for example, the stagnant wages that workers in this country are dealing with as the cost of housing rapidly rises in all parts of the country. We have over 7 million unit gap of affordable housing that is accessible to extremely low income households. And in a world like that, no matter what we are doing in terms of policy or organizing responses, even to people experiencing homelessness today, we will not end the crisis of homelessness in this country and create equitable housing solutions. We can do that though with treating housing as a human right.
Thank you. Kashana?
So I actually would say something very similar to what we just heard, and I will just expand a little bit further and say that this idea, right, around who deserves access to housing, to me is fundamentally a white supremacist idea. And so in terms of what is the biggest barrier to access for housing, it's white supremacy in my mind. We do experience, right, access to housing as something that everyone does not deserve currently in the United States. If you meet a certain set of criteria or are deemed worthy in certain ways, then we may collectively feel some sort of empathy if you are unable to access housing, right? But for the people who don't meet those criteria, who haven't lived their lives in certain ways, generally speaking, collectively, our policies indicate that as a whole, we don't mind when those folks don't have access to housing, right? And so this idea that you have to do certain things in order to deserve to have somewhere safe to live, I think is a huge problem when it comes to housing access. I would also say that this idea, this white supremacist idea around who deserves what, also plays out in our zoning and land use laws. And I know that that may be something that people are not necessarily familiar with in terms of the ways in which zoning and land use decisions really do limit access to housing. But we've got a big problem there all across the country for many, many years, right? Since the federal government chose to subsidize large scale white home ownership, we have seen over and over and over largely white communities then work incredibly hard to keep themselves that way, right? So once they were able as a whole to have this dream of home ownership and, suburban communities subsidized, then at that point you can just kind of pick up the ball yourself and continue to implement policies, advocate for policies that keep your communities exclusive and that make sure that your communities exclude folks of color, right, who may be interested in those same opportunities. And so I would say this idea around who is deserving of what, that is fundamentally based on white supremacist ideas, really does continue to have widespread impacts that limit access to housing.
Thank you for that. Medina?
Oh, thank you. This is really powerful. Yeah, I have to agree. Racism, it's a tragedy. It's a global tragedy, and it leads to health problems. Increased incarceration, poverty, and yeah. So on a regular basis here in this program, a lot of people want to be independent and, not rely on program or agency to instruct them on how to get in a place or whatever. But, and some will make the attempts on their own, which is great. But what we're finding is that most of them are denied, or they're told once they submit their application, because of the crime, that it's the apartment was filled. And so, and also the names that the cultural names that may identify your race and stuff. But yeah, I agree with Trishia and Kashana um, wholeheartedly. It's a big elephant in the room that exists and has um, and just glad to see that we're addressing it and talking about it and taking steps to work through it, and it's one individual at a time, one group, and we'll just continue to fight a good fight to make some changes. So, yeah.
Thank you. Kashana, can you tell us a bit of what's happening in Louisiana around racial justice and housing? So what are some of the innovations that are happening that you're really excited about that you feel like the rest of the country could learn from?
Okay. Innovations in racial justice. Louisiana, these are terms that I'm going to struggle to put together. I think most people on the call will be familiar, right, with sort of the landscape of doing racial justice work in the Deep South. It's not easy, right? There's not necessarily political power behind ideas or policies that have the goal of expanding access to certain spaces. And so it's tough. It's a tough landscape, but it's a landscape that my ancestors, right, continued to toil in and build blocks upon which I hope that my work and the work of the office that I lead continues on, right? And so we are doing some really exciting work in terms of access for people who have had involvement with the criminal legal system across the state of Louisiana. Just like across the United States, we see very widespread racial disparities in terms of who is contacted by police, what kinds of things people are charged with after that contact, what kinds of sentences people receive, right? At all these various points along the criminal legal system's track, Black and brown folks are generally going to have worse outcomes than white folks. And so then that, of course, logically extends into the access that folks have to housing. And so we know from our work and from our work with impacted community members, from our work with organizations that support people with arrests or convictions in their backgrounds, we know that when white people have contact with the criminal legal system, they still are going to come out in a better position to find housing and jobs than Black or brown folks who have had that same kind of contact with the system, right? And so we are engaged really in a multi-pronged strategy to ensure that Black and brown people across Louisiana who have had contact with the legal system will still have access to safe housing that they need. So we have engaged in litigation. We are currently litigating a case that is now going to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal, generally speaking, the most conservative federal appellate court in the country. But we have brought a case against a large property owner, multifamily housing complex in a suburban community right outside of New Orleans that refuses to rent to anyone with any sort of arrest or conviction. We have been successful in challenging similar policies in the past. And in this case, we are having to litigate to a federal appellate court over a certain issue of law. We're also attacking policies at the state legislature, right? So we have supported a coalition of community members and organizations who are working to get a bill through that expands access to housing for people with arrests or convictions in their backgrounds. We were not successful in this 2022 legislative session, but we'll continue to bring that bill forward. We are supporting community members in trying to get an ordinance passed at the city council level in New Orleans that makes it unlawful to inquire about someone's background as a way to keep them out of housing. We've also been successful in working with our state housing finance agency, and actually we're part of a coalition in 2021 that ensures now that any affordable unit, any unit subsidized by taxpayers, right, to lower the rent for low-income people, any of those kinds of units now, and there are about 60,000 currently existing across the state of Louisiana, all of those property owners and managers are now barred from creating policies that broadly ban people who have had arrests or convictions in their background. So one of the things that I'm excited about is the possibilities when it comes to ensuring equitable access to housing for our neighbors and fellow community members who do have arrests or convictions in their backgrounds. There's still such a long way to go. And I find inspiration from colleagues that are working on both coasts, right? And in other places across the country where they have been able to harness power at the local level to get ordinances implemented that expand housing access, whether it's programs like a rental registry that ensure that the housing that people have is actually safe and habitable, right? Or ban the box policies at the local level. Communities like Portland that have some really great expanded tenant protections, although I know that my friends who work in Portland would say that they have no tenant protections at all. They certainly are, you know, miles ahead of what tenants here in Louisiana can expect, right? But policies that ensure that landlords have to have cause for evicting tenants. That's something that we can only dream about here in Louisiana. But being in community with advocates across the country makes it possible for those of us who are working in the Deep South, right, to know what possibilities are out there. And so I always appreciate being in community with my colleagues that work in communities that are more progressive so that we can understand what's possible in our community.
Thank you for sharing that. Jasia, I put in the chat to you, what are the some ways that the legal system and policy are working to improve outcomes around race and access to housing? I know you spoke of a few. What's one that you're really excited about?
Well, you know, this is, I find this to be something of a difficult question to answer. And I think maybe to answer it, I first want to give a little bit of context for where I see us as being. You know, I think there are things certainly that are positive and things for us to be excited about. But, you know, as I mentioned in the context of current homelessness, people are really fighting for the ability to survive without being policed and or segregated and shelterized or put into what amounts to, you know, a camp indefinitely and abandoned in those places. And that's really where we are. And that's where we've been. You know, this country, just to put a framework on it, you know, the legal system was founded, you know, from colonialism on, you know, on land that was colonized, stolen land. The wealth in this country through this period of slavery was built on the labor of stolen lives. And I think this is really important for us to note, not just in the South, but you know, human beings were used as collateral for loans. The cotton that was created in the South was used to build up wealth in the North. There's no part of this country where the legal system and the wealth that's been accumulated by the elites who still benefit from the privileges inherent in our legal system aren't still active and still excluding people from access, from wealth accumulation, and they take different forms. Like, for example, they may take what feels like a less innocuous sort of form of discrimination in a zoning ordinance that prohibits anything other than single family zoning, for example. So we're seeing some positive movement. You know, Shonda hit on some of it, but you know, like, for example, there are inclusionary zoning policies where in California, for example, there is a requirement for some areas within every governmental unit, like a city, to have places that can establish things that we might see as less than permanent housing, but that are still stable places where people can be, like transitional housing as a use by right, where you don't have to get, you know, some sort of use permission in order to establish that type of location. We also are seeing, you know, we know that discrimination and access to rental housing takes a lot of different forms. For example, Black people, and again, this is going to be very familiar to, I think, a lot of the audience members, certainly to the other panelists, are shown fewer units, are quoted higher moving costs, and end up paying more money over the course of the first year. If they are given access to housing in the first place, people are being funneled into neighborhoods of lower opportunity, and that is commonplace and it's well documented. There are studies that have been done showing that this is true. Pashanda's shop has people who go out into the community to suss out some of the people who are doing that in the New Orleans and greater Louisiana area, and it's characteristic of how it's working. Having said that, we are seeing some laws that are prohibiting discrimination in access to housing. That can be in the form of a fair housing law that specifically prohibits limiting access to housing choice, or requires, as the Federal Fair Housing Act does, affirmative action to further fair housing and to reduce the effect of segregation over time. But we really have a long way to go. And that's a circuitous way to get to a thing that I think is really truly exciting, and that is just generally positive, though to a layperson it may sound like moving in the wrong direction, but a right to counsel in housing cases, and the ability for people who are at risk of losing their housing, or who are facing discrimination and access to housing, having an advocate who can work within the systems that have been weaponized against people can help balance power, can help do things from buying people more time so that they can make to sorry, there I went on mute there, so I'll wrap up. But I do think that the growing movement for a right to counsel in housing cases and in other cases where housing access and preservation is an issue is a really positive thing.
So I have a question for Medina. I want you all to start putting your questions in the chat so I know how much time we need to allot for audience questions, because I have a number of other questions, but I would love to get to yours as well. But Medina, so can you tell us how the men, because when we talked earlier, when we were talking about doing this event, and I got an opportunity to see virtually the organization and the nuances and the level of service and support that these men are getting. Can you tell us how they are positively impacting housing justice in their community? So they're not just coming in and getting services, but we spoke a little bit about, like, what are they doing with this experience, and how are they making changes in the world based on the support that they're getting?
Okay, yes, great question. So we have this wonderful advocacy group that's run by or facilitated by an advocacy coordinator who is amazing, longstanding employee with Central City Concern. And the group of men, people, they don't have to sign up for the advocacy component, but most of them jump at the chance because they get to elevate their voices, as Billy like to call it, which they do, which is very empowering. But they meet once a month, and during that time, they bring up topics that or changes they'd like to see. It's very informal discussion where they get together and support one another. Sometimes it's just a rap session and supporting the newcomer, but the dynamic is a lot of the older gentlemen that have been around the program since it started. Like two of the oldest standing members, one was the first person to ever sign up in the program, and the other was number two. And so the very first people that signed up, enrolled in the program, they come to every single advocacy group. And both of them are now working for Central City Concern. And they're there to encourage. They're pretty much older in years than most of the participants. So they're really kind and approachable, and they're engaging with a lot of these newer members. And it's really fascinating to watch because these are people who are in their dream job, the family reunification, and they're there to let people know, man, if I could do it, you can do it too, and I just like being the fly on the wall to watch it play out because um, every time the meeting is over, they're standing around talking for like 30 more minutes on a Saturday, even, Saturday morning. So, yeah, and they're also doing things like when they get jobs out in the community and they see another person having difficulty finding the right job for them. They're letting their employer know, hey, I got a friend, and they're just by namesake, people, they're helping others get jobs. They're giving back in such a tremendous way without you don't we don't even have to ask them or suggest that they help the newest member or come to the groups. They want to do it. They want to help, and that's what keeps them inspired. They also learn how to, when they're advocating for change with policies, they work alongside the public policy department here at Central City Concern, who helps them um, tell their story in 2 minutes. Some of our participants have done a straight stint. The oldest, I believe, served 32 years straight, you know, and he had a lot to say, and I don't know if we've ever heard, we haven't heard everything that, injustices and changes that he'd like to see, but they teach them how to go to City Hall and tell their story in 2 minutes. Now, can you imagine condensing 30 years into 2 minutes? But they learn to do so, and they're being heard, and yeah, it's just starting the wheel of change. So yeah, they're giving back tremendously. They're volunteering, even after work, their time to go out and help clean out neighbors' garages and things like that. People want to do better, and that's, you know, pretty much the moral of what I see here. People want to change. They don't want to revert back to the criminal ways and incarceration and, separation from their families and things like that, And so, yeah, sometimes you just need that structure to do so, or a little guidebook.
Thank you. That
Mhm.
really brings to light for me the silencing of individuals who are experiencing houselessness and the fact that we don't often hear their stories from their perspectives. So that's a really powerful way to advance the movement by helping individuals with multiple things that have happened tell their story and talk about how housing is an intricate part of that story. So just that brings to like the power of storytelling for me. And so I'm not seeing a lot of questions in the chat, y'all. And I'm thinking some of you have some really top of mind things you'd like to either ask directly to our panel or you want to write in the chat. So please don't be shy. This is your opportunity. We really set this up as a meeting. I know it's a webinar and you're learning a lot and I'm learning a lot, but we want you to feel like you can be front and center and asking questions if you're curious about anything. So don't be shy. I'll move on to my second question as I'm waiting. Please raise your hand also if you just want to ask it in person. So the next question I have is, how do you center community and what matters to people in your work? And why is this important? I think this is a common question we've been talking about throughout the country for a while. Centering community, making sure that stories are told and voices are heard. But sometimes we don't explore the practicality of how leaders are doing it, how organizations are doing it, how legislative bodies are doing it. So, Tristia, how are you all in your advocacy centering community, gathering the information from the community to propel the movement?
This is an ongoing struggle for a variety of reasons. our core constituency are people who are living outside now and don't have access to all of the ways that, for example, people today are plugging into this conversation. So people aren't necessarily going to be able to be in a safe, stable, quiet spot where they have, the ability to plug in. They may not have electronics. They may need to go stand in a line in order to meet basic daily needs for a shower, for a meal, those are all struggles that we, as a small organization trying to work nationally, can only navigate with partnerships. And so we deliberately partner with groups that have organizers that are accountable to the community. So there's sort of a standard for organizing. We make sure that people that we're working with are truly out in the community, doing outreaches, talking with people, hearing their stories, have leadership from those communities, and are meeting the needs that are prioritized and described by those communities, not needs that we might superimpose on those communities. So that's one of the ways that we try to stay accountable to and partner. Just two other kind of quick things for convenings. We try to in our budgets, and I think this is something that a lot of groups and nonprofits can and should do if they're not doing now, have a line item for compensating people for their time. When they share their expertise and their time, that is a real resource investment. It's not only an emotional investment, but it's also something that requires a lot of time and effort on somebody's part. They may need to, as I said, travel to a location where they can just have the access that I think a lot of us have, from the comfort of our homes. This is something that a lot of folks lack. So ensuring that people can be compensated. Monetary compensation is always great, but there are non-monetary ways that people can be compensated as well. You can elevate people's social media profiles. You can provide people with letters of recommendation so that they can take those to places where they may be seeking employment or housing, or wanting to volunteer, to do anything that other people might want to do. That type of credit can really be helpful to someone, and it doesn't cost your organization anything to do it. And it's I think important to building community.
That's awesome. I'm going to ask Kashana this question. What has been a recent success in housing justice that inspires you?
Thank you, because I actually was realizing that I wanted to share an additional success, and Tristia actually reminded me of it, so thank you. We were lucky enough to be able to gain the City Council of New Orleans support in passing a right to counsel ordinance here in New Orleans just a few months back. And so what that means now is that any renter who lives within New Orleans who is facing an eviction will have access to an attorney, right? And so the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center is providing eviction defense representation services to community members who are facing the possibility of being kicked out of their homes. And the local legal aid office, Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, is the main service provider. And so we provide additional services for community members who may be over income to qualify for legal aid services. We also can represent people who are undocumented. And so getting the City Council on board with that has been a recent success that is pretty inspiring, makes things feel pretty hopeful in terms of the work. And it is a program that I'm glad that New Orleans is now a part of. There are multiple cities across the country that have right to counsel ordinances. And I certainly hope that communities in every state will see that kind of program. But what it does is really sort of level the playing field in many respects, right? We know that the overwhelming majority of landlords who go to eviction court do have attorneys. And we also know that tenants who are represented by a lawyer are much more likely to be able to stay in their home than our tenants who don't have access to a lawyer. We also know that there are still a very high number of tenants who never go to eviction court when they receive a notice. And that may be for a variety of reasons, right? Maybe they realize that if they don't have a lawyer, they're very likely to get kicked out. And so they spend that time instead going to look for other housing. Maybe they need to go to work, or else they're going to be fired and then won't have any money to pay for a different place to live, right? There are a variety of reasons why people all across the country are not able to go to eviction court. And when you don't go to court, you don't even get a chance to stay in your home, right? The way that eviction laws are set up all across the country, if you're not there in court, oftentimes the landlord doesn't even have to present any evidence. You just lose by virtue of not being there, right? We also know that community members, particularly people of color, may have some very reasonable fear about interacting with the court system, right? They may be afraid for a variety of reasons to even go into a courthouse. Maybe the courthouse is intimidating. It might be in a neighborhood where they're not welcome and they've never been able to travel to. Perhaps folks might have outstanding warrants. Perhaps they may not speak English as a first language and are understanding that they won't have access to the proceedings in whatever language they do speak, right? And so there are all these reasons why people are unable to attend eviction court hearings, but instead of taking those reasons into account, they just lose and are evicted. And so the right to counsel programs that we see across the country really do bring a level of hope into communities and really do serve to even the playing field just a bit. And so I'm very honored to have been part of the effort here to bring Right to Counsel program. So thankful for the leadership of community members who did travel to tell their stories, right? Who were able to speak to the city council about what it meant to them to not have had access or to have had access to an attorney. And to Tristia's point, we certainly do make sure to provide compensation for community members who travel to, whether it's the state legislature or the city council or to meetings. We want to ensure that we are supporting people's ability to be able to participate in the decision-making that affects them.
Awesome. Medina, what is the best advice you could give people navigating within the current system, both folks looking for housing and people working for and with them?
I would say definitely work with your providers. It's not easy, and the system has been traditionally designed for people to fail, people of color. You know, especially when you are trying to obtain housing of your choice. So, you know, certain neighborhoods and income status, you know, disqualifies people largely. So I would say work with the agencies, the local agencies. You know, if you're BIPOC, culturally specific, who may be a little bit more culturally responsive and understanding of your needs, that can help walk you through. Because yeah, definitely working with a professional, you know, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Tristia, this question I'm going to punt to you. How do we counter the stereotypes people have of those experiencing homelessness? What is the most helpful in changing people's perceptions of those experiencing homelessness and increasing their willingness to understand and help?
I think the only way to break down stereotypes of any type, including people experiencing homelessness, is by being proximate to people experiencing homelessness. We have to see our fellow human beings, understand them as our fellow human beings who have stories, and stop relying on the tropes and the myths and stereotypes that inform our understanding of the human beings who are living outside right now. the best way for people to hear the stories of unhoused people is from unhoused people. And there are a couple of things that I just shout out really quickly. There's a group called Invisible People. Mark Horvath is a gentleman who goes around and interviews. He's based in LA, but he travels around the country, and he hands out socks, which is a pretty typically unmet need for people who are living outside, and interviews them to describe what they're experiencing. And you'll hear a lot of different stories and what he promises to the people who agree to film with him. And I think he has typically just used his phone, is that he won't cut up their story. He's not going to sell it to anyone without their permission. He's not going to take sound bites and try to tell a narrative. People can tell their own stories. And through that process, Invisible People has been able to generate a tremendous amount of attention, get millions of views on YouTube and through the website, large social media presence where those videos are shared. And they're now doing short films, kind of telling some of the typical stories of what leads somebody out of housing. They're doing one about, a person who is evicted. They've done one about a woman who, loses her job and is living in a vehicle. Really typical stories that are told, from people who are living those experiences. And so this is not just meant to be a commercial for Invisible People, but I do think it's a great example of how we can break down stereotypes. And I'll end really quickly by saying, I think we also need to do an internal check. I think it's really common for people to have their own biases about others that they maybe don't believe that they have. And when it comes to groups of people experiencing homelessness, I don't know how many of us truly interact regularly with people experiencing homelessness. That might lead us to feel or to be vulnerable to the stereotypes that are so typical and prevalent in the media, like people experiencing homelessness are primarily substance addicted, or people experiencing homelessness are primarily mentally ill, or any of the other things that are untrue when you look at the data and are demonstrably false when you actually work with the population of people. And so, doing that internal check and fighting against our own internal biases, I think this is an important thing as well.
Awesome. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to combine two things that I'm really curious about. And one thing that is a signature moment for us at the Blueprint events. Is there, Principle 6 of our Blueprint says, set our default to sustaining transformation beyond the pandemic. We know that with the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of emphasis put on innovations to help people during that really crazy chaotic time. Is there something in a call to action for us as a Blueprint community, as people on the call, that can help us double down on setting our default to sustaining transformations that each of you saw really impactful? Am I making sense? So I'd love to just hear from you all, combining this idea of call to action and something that's tangible that we've seen during the pandemic that was an innovation. What does that look like for us as leaders and advocates on this call? And I'll start with Kashana.
So I think the thing that we are all called to do, right, is to not lose the sense of urgency. So we all ostensibly have learned so much over these last few years. Some of us have just come to the cause of racial justice, right? Some of us may have just understood the racial disparities that exist across the country as a result of the disparities in who was impacted by the pandemic, right? We saw the fact that initially Black folks were certainly more likely to test positive and suffer the ultimate effects of the COVID-19 virus, right? We saw white Americans' behavior as a whole change once they realized who was being most impacted by the virus. And so there were a variety of ways in which the racial disparities that are present in so many areas of the country really began to come into focus during the pandemic. Of course, we saw many people gain an understanding that perhaps they didn't have before about the ways in which policing works in this country, right? The violent nature of policing. Many of us just sort of understood for the first time. And so I would say that with everything that we learned, or with everything that we further learned, right, during this time, we need to continue to grow and to work in our community to change the systems that have led to these outcomes that we all know are problematic. I think there are a variety of ways in which to do this. If there is an agency, an organization, a nonprofit working to support people who are unhoused, if there is a fair housing group in your community, get engaged, right, with the people who are doing that work. Continue to read and learn things. You know, there's been lots of social media jokes around the fact that so many white Americans were interested in learning about racial justice and racial disparities, and people were buying books by, you know, Black and brown authors. And there have been a lot of jokes around it. Were those books actually read, right? If you're on the call and you bought those books and never read them, do that, right? Share those resources with your friends. I have a variety of resources that I'm just going to run through very quickly, and nobody asked me for this, but I usually like to share because I hear from people all the time, how can I learn more about this, right? So if you haven't read Evicted by Matthew Desmond, a great place to start. It's a very approachable book that looks at the ways in which landlord-tenant laws and our eviction system impacts 8 families in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a great book, very approachable for people who maybe aren't into the professorial or academic approach. If you haven't read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, it's a book that looks at and examines how the federal government actually segregated communities across the country, right? And I think it's a fascinating history for people who maybe haven't been aware. And of course, all of these resources are available like in an audiobook format as well. If you enjoy podcasts, there is an episode of This American Life that is a few years old now, but holds up fairly well. It's called The Problem We All Live With. It's named after the iconic painting of Ruby Bridges, you know, desegregating the New Orleans elementary school. And it's an episode that looks at school segregation and housing segregation through the life of Michael Brown, the young man who was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. That community has a very interesting but not unique history in that it was really created again by this government sponsored white home ownership drive. And so that story looks at the ways in which segregation created the kind of community where Michael Brown was really targeted by police, and where young Black and brown people are very likely to have interactions with the police. I would also say that there is another podcast that may be helpful to folks, Nice White Parents, which takes a look at some of the politics around school segregation in New York. So these are some of the resources that I find helpful in discussing, right, a lot of what we're talking about today, and that I think might be useful as people seek to deepen their knowledge and also find new or additional ways to engage in the work.
So we will send out all of those resources, Kashana, with a recording, a link to the recording for this, for those that could attend and those that were not able, all that registered, but that is extremely helpful. I am going to start wrapping us up because we have a part 2 of this. And the part 2 is all dedicated to innovation and really great programming that's happening, really great resources that are happening. So we invite you all to join us for that, my call to action for you, on top of the leaders that spoke today, their calls to action around learning more, being available, advocating more, understanding what's happening in the world, getting upfront and personal with the people experiencing homelessness or houselessness in your communities. Our call to action is to join our movement at the Wellbeing Blueprint. We have these conversations all the time. Through your joining, you're able to strengthen the movement by becoming a signer. So if you desire that, we invite you to do that. It gives you the ability to connect with leaders outside of your community at a national level on biweekly discussions that we highlight all kinds of different advocacies and areas, things that are working well, things that need to be deepened in our country in order to make sure that we're building a country where everyone has a fair shot at well-being. And then exploring our well-being innovations map to hear more about what other organizations and leaders and communities are doing to advance well-being. Please explore our map. It'll give you a lot of ideas, but it's also part of that connecting, us building a web of leaders that are connecting nationally and locally across the country to drive this work forward. I also want to provide, the next slide is, I think Sasha can advance the slide, information, and this will go out in an email. They will provide information on our guests and all the work that they're doing and their bios and the agencies that they work for. So this will go out to you all as well, but feel free to copy this information down. And then last but not least, I want to thank everybody. And most importantly, thank our speakers for your time, your passion, your energy, how you're showing up in the world. It is inspiring at the least, and at the most, it makes me want to go out and just change the world even more. So it's a very good continuum for me just to see how you all are doing it. I'm on fire for this idea around housing justice now. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you for spending time with us to learn. This is where it starts to grow, to provide information. We will have another event. We welcome you all to, and I hope you all have an amazing day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.